This is Dr. Andy Johnson and the Reading Instruction Show. Today, we are looking at things we can do to help your child with reading at home. I want to give you some tips to keep your child engaged, some advice on teaching, and you notice I have quotation marks there, and then some specific ideas for enhancing reading fluency. I know this is difficult. I know this is tough. However, you want to keep things as simple as possible. There's no complex answers. Usually the simple things are the best things. There's no super secret strategies, no best program that you need to buy. There's no best method or approach, whether you're in school or at home. It starts, though, with understanding the basic process that the brain uses to create meaning with print. That is key. First of all, reading is not sounding out words. We often think it's that, and we think that struggling readers just need more sounding out word practice. If they could just sound out more words, you say, then they could read or read better. But that's not the case. But think about this. When you read the stuff on the screen, are you doing all this stuff in the microsecond it takes to look at a word? Are you putting the sounds to a letter, putting the sounds together, creating words, attaching words to other words, and creating ideas? Is that what your brain is doing? I think not. Reading is creating meaning with print. There is a two-way flow of information. Information from the cortex flows down onto the page to help you understand. And here is something that neuroscience has taught us. There is almost 10 times more information flowing from the cortex down than from the page up during the process of reading. It's an interactive process. That means we're using what's up here to understand what is on the page. That's an important thing. Now, there are 3 cueing systems: phonological, syntactic, and semantic. And we'll get to that in a minute. But know that effective readers use very few letter cues when creating meaning with print. Remember, reading is creating meaning with print, not sounding out words. When you looked at that sentence, you did not process every single letter. Matter of fact, your eyes were going this way and that, and you probably stopped on, maybe 5 or 6 of these words, but your brain, that top-down flow of information, was filling in the blanks. For example, look at that sentence. Most of you could create meaning with that, even though all the vowels that were not first in the word were taken out. Absolutely. Creating meaning with print, top-down flow of information. Our brain, when we see words on the page, uses not 1, but 3. We use semantics, context clues, syntax, which is grammar and word order, to recognize words, and we use phonics, letter sounds. Of those 3, the phonological cueing system is the least efficient in terms of how much space it takes up in short-term memory. Now, an overemphasis on phonics can actually impede students' progress. And I've seen students reading very well. They come to a word and all of a sudden they stop and they're looking at each letter and it slows them up and all that stuff in short-term memory. Now, when I say to the student, well, just say blank and move on. They say blank, move on, all of a sudden, they recognize the word. All right? That's using semantics. It uses far less processing space and far less time. So to teach them, I actually say blank and just keep moving on, and they end up going back. It takes far less time and space. Now, this doesn't mean that phonics should not be taught. Every single person that I've ever encountered believes that phonics, letter sounds, should be taught. It should not be taught as the exclusive way to recognize words. It's one of 3 ways. So we need to create activities to develop all 3 cueing systems, and word identification is probably the topic of another webcast or podcast. All right. So 4 tips for keeping your students engaged in reading at home. First of all, when you're reading with your child aloud, stop correcting mistakes. This will be tough. I know it. Now listen to me. And remember, the emotional component of reading, especially with struggling readers, is very tough. I recommend strongly, and this is what I do, when you don't recognize a word, say blank and keep moving on, or just ignore it. Skip the word. All right? Remember, reading is creating meaning with print. Often, if they skip the word, they're still creating meaning. They can go back. And as long as a student is creating meaning with print, they don't need to sound out every word if they're getting the ideas. As well, students need the opportunity to develop metacognition. That's, does it make sense? So if we jump in and we correct them right away, they don't develop this opportunity to say, does that make sense? And go back and fix it up. As well, students become very reflexive if they're being corrected all the time. So stop doing that. Well, what do you do if the student stops and asks you for help? You say this, what makes sense? And again, they're developing semantic if you say that. Or else say, give it your best guess. Or else skip it and move on. Here's 3 things you should say when you're reading with your child. Never say, sound it out, because children know that already. You're not telling them. But again, sounding it out takes more cognitive space. You're slowing them down. And when you slow them down and focus on individual letters and words, they're not focusing on ideas. We want them to focus on meaning, not letters. And students are already doing that anyway. Duh, I know you should sound it out. I'm just not good at it. Don't do that. Here's something that will freak you out. 99% of all students know how to read. I would say 99.9. They know the process. A letter makes a sound. You put the letter sounds together to create word. They all know that. Like I know how to play the piano. They're just not very good at it. And what do you do when you're not good at something? Why, I hope you practice, just like practicing the piano. You need a little instruction, but a lot of reading practice. So tip number 2, students need reading practice. Instead of reading class, we should call it reading practice. Just like you need volleyball practice and piano practice and writing practice. Children, adults need practice. You get better by practicing reading. Now, at home, reading practice should be a big part of the instruction or intervention. What they read should be at their independent level or below. We don't want to frustrate or overwhelm students. All right? It's that emotional component. It's the encounter with words and sentences and phrases that helps them develop the ability to create meaning with print. Comic books are just fine as well, or graphic novels. The goal is to get them immersed in print, to help them fall in love with books. As well, with any type of practice, we need to be regular and consistent. 10 minutes a day of focused practice is much better than spread out practice, or 40 minutes in which a child is not focused. 10 minutes a day for 4 days, better than 40 minutes a day for 1 day. Brain gets to process in between. So regular and consistent. It does not have to be long as it's consistent. And here's the thing. If children are engaged in books for 10 minutes a day, 4 days a week, if they have good books to read, they will eventually fall in love with books. Volume of reading is important. Much more important than reading level. The goal is to expose them to letter patterns, words, sentence structure, and concept. So this brain gets better at recognizing these things, recognizing patterns, recognizing sentence structure. As well, as part of this, your reading to children is important. A read aloud book at bedtime. A great story that may be, a chapter book, that may be above their reading level. This is the stuff you read to them. You are exposing. them to vocabulary and sentence structure and concepts, and you're helping them fall in love with books. I'm tutoring a child, and her mother is reading Little House on the Prairie, which is a little above her reading level, but she loves it, and she's learning new stuff and falling and being exposed to all these other things. So, an important understanding, you don't teach reading. Most children know how to read, they just can't read very well. So, you are creating the conditions whereby your child can develop the ability to create meaning with print. Now, it is much like learning to speak and listen. They learn to speak and listen by being immersed in real language and listening and speaking for real purposes. So you want to create these conditions. Which leads us to tip number 3. Set weekly reading goals. And I'm going to give you some ideas here. And start low, but the goals could be number of books read or number of pages read. I would recommend starting with number of minutes read. Start low so you don't frustrate, so that child can achieve his or her reading goals. Now, reading 4 days a week out of 7, that's great. Start with 4. 7, of course, would be great, but you want these goals to be attainable. Set aside consistent time for reading practice. Again, 10 minutes a day is fine. 4 to 5 days a week. If you have good books, the child will read. Think about a family reading time where you all read together. You shut stuff off and they see you reading as well. That would be ideal. But I know in these busy times that you have, time is tough. You have conflicting schedules. Now, having access to good books is key. How do you learn to read if you don't have good stuff to read? That is the big dilemma. If you have access to a school library, you should be getting regular books, or a community library. We all have different lending systems. There are some online books. I use Reading A to Z. They have books, a variety of levels. That's something that I use. And you can reread other books, but finding good books is one important thing. Having a school or community library, that's an excellent resource. A teacher's number one job is to help children fall in love with books. After that, 98% of their job is complete. If the child wants to read, the child will be engaged and motivated to read. Now, choice is important. And think about it. When you go into a bookstore, no one assigns you a book. When you go into a library, no one says you have to read that book and you can't read that. So choice is choice of what to read. Choice, here's an important one. If you don't like a book, you can stop. That's just fine. Choice of when to read. Now, this does not mean total choice all the time. It could be a choice between this and that. But the idea of choice is motivating to the child. A choice of how to read and where to read. How to read the book. Do you want to read it sitting down? Do you want to read it in your bed? Do you want to read it here or there? That is how to read. That's kind of a where to read as well. All right, here's tip number 4. Create some chart to keep track of stuff. The minutes read, or the books, or the pages. So on Monday, you'd say, we read these books, and these were the minutes, and these were the pages. If you're reading chapter books, and have this someplace. Adopt and adapt this, by the way, where you could keep this in a notebook, in a file folder someplace, on a computer. You could put up a poster. You decide. But keep it someplace, keep it regularly. Now, in an ideal situation, the child would be able to record this as well. Minutes read, pages, and the names of the books read that day. Maybe the same book is spread out over several days. That's fine if they're older and reading chapter books. I would encourage some sort of rating system, either inside cover of the book or on the chart or a refrigerator someplace or on a Google Doc where you're sharing it with other students. Here you have the title of the book, and the child decides to give it some rating. Excellent, good, okay, didn't like, stinker. Of course, adopt and adapt this system. This gets them talking about books. Now, when I'm working with many students, I like to have a common place where they can rate because it creates conversation and social interaction. Oh, I didn't think that was a stinker. I thought it was great. Or here's an excellent book. I loved it. And when children find other children liking books, they're more apt to want to read that book. Goes back to that motivation thing again. And again, adopt and adapt some sort of rating. We have the title. For younger kids, sometimes it's a happy face, a straight face, and a sad face. Adopt and adapt. So, 4 tips. Stop correcting mistakes. Practice reading. Set weekly reading goals. And keep track of stuff. 4 simple tips. Now, ideas for the child who is highly resistant. And I've worked with many of these. Set short, specific goals. Today we're just going to read 2 pages. That's short and specific. All right? Be regular, short, and consistent. Again, 5 minutes of focused time is better than 15 minutes of unfocused time. 10 minutes of focused time better than 30 minutes of unfocused time. You need to have lots of good reading material for the child to read. And sometimes it's a choice. All right, we're going to do this for 10 minutes. Your choice is you can sit there and you can do nothing, or you could read. Maybe the first day they'll do nothing, but eventually they all choose to read. The choice is to do nothing and sit there and read, and you're all reading. The child will read. I'll bet you $20. And then scaffolded oral reading. I'm going to explain that. 3 specific strategies: scaffolded oral reading, score, language experience activity, and fluency. Really silly stories. Now with score, this is a variation of the neurological impress method, and I'm going to demonstrate this in just a minute. But you're reading out loud with the child, but you're reading just a millisecond ahead to provide just a scaffold. You don't pause if the child does not recognize a word or stumbles. You keep moving and you provide a scaffold, and you use a quiet voice just enough to keep the child moving ahead. If the child is more proficient, maybe you just sound out the first word or a couple of words here and there. You decide. Every other paragraph, you can have the child read independently 1 paragraph, and then you use score the next one, etc., etc. All right? Variations of score. Whole passage, or maybe you do every other passage. They read one independently, and you read the next one using scaffolded oral reading, independent score, independent score. All right? Now, let me show you an example of scaffolded oral reading. First is we go to their list and we ask the student what book they would like to read. All right, let's read this together. Now when we do that, I get just a little ahead of where the student is. I'm just keeping the pace moving. All right? Okay, Betty, let's read this together. Living in Africa, cheetahs speed across Africa's grassy savannas. Cheetahs are the fastest animals on excellent. Animals, yes. Running makes cheetahs hot. Find a cool place to rest on the savannah. Do you like this book? Should we keep going or should we find it? Do you like this book? Choice is very important. After a page or 2, you always ask, do you want to keep reading or would you like to find another book? Just like you and I, they should be able to choose which book they want to read. And I'll do this maybe 2 or 3 times. All right?
Sometimes when you do a syllable, you go cheetahs.
Cheetahs. Look at this. She is good. Yes. Okay, you get the idea. That's scaffolded oral reading, and that is me demonstrating that. The language experience approach. This is so good. The child is reading. First, you have an experience, and then you write about it. The child dictates to you. What did you do yesterday? Okay, well, let's write about it. And I like to use a computer, use 24-point font so I can save it, but I do this every day. The child dictates, and then the child rereads until fluency is achieved. Now, when I do this, I usually have a minimum of 5 sentences, and I use it in paragraph form. And you can see when I actually did this summer. Don't do it in list form. With really emerging readers, I might have 2 sentences, but usually it's 5. So we reread it until fluency is achieved. Usually it's once or twice. So they're practicing reading using words and experiences and concepts with which they are familiar. This is much easier. They're learning to read using words that they actually used. There's an example there. Then we use analytic phonics, meaning there's a word here that ends with the n sound. Can you find it? Yes, open. Okay. There's a word here that has the long A or the A sound. Very good. All right. That is an example of analytic phonics. You're analyzing sounds within a word, and these are words with which they are familiar. Okay. Save on a Word document. This is why I like using a computer screen, because I save them, and at the end of the week we can practice reading stuff that they have written, and we can save them, and they have books that they have written, and they can practice. That's a good thing, to practice reading every day. Students can include pictures as well. I had a student that had a picture of her dog. She loves her dog, so she sent me that. We put it in the Word document, and she was, what do you want to say about your dog? And she said a whole bunch of stuff, and we practiced reading. It was great. It was great. And the last idea is really silly stories. This is a great idea, great activity for developing reading fluency. Now, there's 3 deficit areas: word identification, 3 deficit areas for reading: word identification, fluency, and comprehension. Today we're working just on fluency, all right? Now, really silly stories is designed to develop reading fluency. This takes 3 to 5 minutes at most, and it develops self-efficacy because students see themselves getting better, and it really enhances reading fluency. Fluency is the ability to quickly process letters, letter patterns, and words. Now here it is. It's a story that's silly. It has a lot of repetition, repeated words, and it has dialogue. These are all things with which students are familiar. They're more familiar with dialogue than they are expository text, because that's the sound of the language around them. And I have marked off the 30th word and the 40th word. We read to, either, if they're very beginning, the 30th word; if they're more advanced, the 40th word, and we time them for each attempt. They get 3 attempts, and we time their times after each attempt. First try, second try, third try. They see themselves getting better. This was day 1, 40 words, and these are the times. At 5 weeks, twice a week, we see at 50 words, we see the times going better. So this really is effective, and I'll show you some results that we had. This is a really silly story. Again, it's a story that's kind of silly. They read either to the 30th or 40th word. You time each attempt, and you record the times somehow. All right? Lots of repetition, dialogue. I have a bigger story broken into 6 to 10 parts. They do just 1 part each day, and they record each attempt. You can record them in a table like this, a line graph like that. This would be each of the 3 attempts, or a bar graph, and I like to have students record this. And again, it develops self-efficacy. They can see themselves getting better. Now, There are some free, really silly stories at readosity.com. You can go there and you will see them. Printable directions and the stories are right there. That's free. You can use that. I recommend it. Bunch of really silly stories with the 30th and the 40th word marked. Now, I have been doing this with a student from October to December. We started at that Lexile level, 50 words per minute, word identification, and we weren't working on word identification. All right, but then we moved up to the 440 Lexile level. You can see this is the biggest increase, and this was 14 sessions spread out over 7 weeks. A third grade student, this is a pretty dramatic increase in words per minute score. And this student's mother also made sure the student had books and practice reading at home, and mother was reading Little House on the Prairie with the child every day as well. So all that combined, reading practice with the really silly stories and things I was doing, but the really silly stories really helps. So 3 specific strategies: scaffolded oral reading, language experience approach, you can do both of these, and really silly stories. That's a repeated reading activity to develop fluency. Hopefully I've answered that question and given you some ideas to think about. Keep it simple. There's no one idea that works for everybody. If you have questions or things you'd like me to cover on future podcasts or webinars, there's my address right there. Happy to deal with any one of these issues. Let me know. And this is a book I have coming out soon, Designing Meaning-Based Interventions for Struggling Readers.